December 18th, 1944, 14:25 hours, near Bastogne, Belgium. Obergefreiter Fritz Weber sat in frozen mud with 43 other German soldiers, watching American trucks approach the field where they'd surrendered 3 hours earlier. Fritz was 22 years old, had been fighting since Normandy in June, and hadn't eaten a full meal in 4 days. The German supply lines had collapsed during the retreat across France, and the Ardennes offensive that was supposed to turn the war around had instead turned into chaos, where units lost contact with headquarters and soldiers scrounged for food wherever they could find it. The propaganda had been clear about what happened to German soldiers captured by Americans. The Allies would torture prisoners for information, execute officers, and leave enlisted men to starve or freeze. Fritz had believed this completely because the alternative, that propaganda might be lies, was too dangerous to consider while still fighting for Germany. But now he was captured, and the torture hadn't come. Neither had execution or starvation. Instead, American soldiers had searched them for weapons, provided blankets against the December cold, and were now apparently bringing food. The trucks stopped. American soldiers jumped down and began unloading metal containers that steamed in the winter air. The smell hit Fritz before he could see what was being served. Meat, grease, something that might have been coffee. His stomach cramped from hunger that had been constant companion for weeks. Around him, other German prisoners were staring at the American field kitchen with expressions mixing disbelief and desperate hope. An American sergeant, Fritz couldn't understand the rank insignia, but the authority was obvious, gestured for the German prisoners to form a line. Fritz stood on legs that shook partly from cold and partly from exhaustion, joining the queue that shuffled toward the field kitchen where American cooks were filling metal trays with food that looked more substantial than anything Fritz had been issued by German quartermasters in 6 months of combat. When Fritz reached the serving line, an American cook handed him a tray containing portions that seemed impossibly large. Some kind of stew with visible chunks of meat and vegetables, bread that was actually white rather than the black ersatz bread Germany had been producing since 1943, and a tin cup filled with coffee that smelled real rather than the roasted grain substitute that German military had been calling coffee for 2 years. Fritz took his tray and sat in the mud, staring at the food for several seconds before actually eating. The stew was hot, genuinely hot, not lukewarm like the meals German field kitchens produced when they functioned at all. He took a cautious bite, then another, then began eating rapidly, despite knowing that sudden food after days of hunger could cause stomach problems. The American soldier sitting nearby, apparently assigned to guard the prisoners but holding his rifle casually rather than pointing it, watched Fritz eat and smiled slightly. He said something in English that Fritz didn't understand, but the tone seemed friendly rather than mocking. Fritz looked up from his tray and spoke in German without thinking about whether the American could understand. "This is the best thing I ever had." The American soldier obviously didn't understand the words, but he seemed to recognize the tone. He nodded, gave a thumbs-up gesture, and said something else in English that included the word good repeated twice. Fritz returned to his meal, eating with concentration that blocked out everything except the immediate experience of hot food filling his empty stomach for the first time in days. The logistics of abundance. American soldiers at the front received approximately 4,000 calories daily through various ration types: K rations for mobile operations, C rations for field use, B rations when field kitchens could operate, and A rations when circumstances permitted fresh food preparation. The caloric content exceeded what most American civilians consumed during the Depression, reflected military recognition that combat operations and winter conditions required substantial food intake to maintain physical performance and morale. German military rations had declined steadily throughout the war as supply difficulties, Allied bombing of transportation networks, and general economic deterioration reduced both quantity and quality of food available to frontline troops. By late 1944, German soldiers were receiving approximately 2,800 calories daily when supply lines functioned properly, substantially less when combat disrupted logistics. The quality had declined even more dramatically, with ersatz substitutes replacing real coffee, chocolate, and other items that required imports Germany could no longer obtain. The contrast between American abundance and German scarcity was stark and obvious to anyone who'd experienced both systems. Fritz Weber had been adequately fed during his initial training in 1943, when Germany still maintained some supply capacity. But conditions had deteriorated throughout 1944 as Allied bombing destroyed railways, bridges, and supply depots, while advancing armies consumed resources faster than Germany's shrinking industrial base could replace them. By December 1944, Fritz considered himself fortunate on days when he received any hot food at all, regardless of quality or quantity. The American meal Fritz received as prisoner contained approximately 1,200 calories, enough for a substantial hot meal that would provide energy and warmth for several hours. The stew included actual beef from American cattle ranches, vegetables from American farms, and seasonings that had been transported across the Atlantic along with the troops who were fighting to liberate Europe. The bread was made from wheat flour rather than potato or sawdust mixtures that German bakers were forced to use. The coffee was real rather than roasted grain or chicory root. To Fritz, who'd been subsisting on inadequate rations and scavenged food for months, the American meal represented abundance that seemed almost criminal during wartime, when everyone was supposed to be suffering equally. The cognitive dissonance was immediate and disorienting. He was a prisoner, a defeated enemy, yet he was eating better than he'd eaten as German soldier, with theoretically full rights to German military logistics. The camp where enemies became humans. Fritz was transferred to permanent POW camp in northeastern France in February 1945, joining approximately 8,000 German prisoners housed in facility that had been established to hold captured personnel until the war ended and repatriation became possible. The camp was basic but well organized, with wooden barracks heated by stoves, adequate sanitation facilities, and recreational areas where prisoners could exercise and socialize during non-working hours. The daily routine was structured around work assignments that were required under Geneva Convention provisions, allowing captors to employ prisoner labor for non-military purposes. Fritz was assigned to agricultural work on nearby farms, where labor shortages had become critical as French men were serving in the military or had been killed during years of German occupation. The work was hard, but no worse than military service, and it provided structure that made captivity more tolerable than sitting idle in barracks all day. The relationship between prisoners and guards evolved over months, from purely custodial to something approaching cordial coexistence. The American guards were generally young men who'd been assigned to POW duty because they lacked combat training or had been wounded and returned to duty in non-combat roles. Many were themselves from immigrant families, Irish, Polish, Italian backgrounds that made them sympathetic to European prisoners who were also far from home. The guards enforced regulations but weren't harsh unless prisoners created problems that required disciplinary response. Fritz developed working relationship with Sergeant Michael O'Brien, an Irish-American from Boston who supervised agricultural work details. O'Brien spoke no German, and Fritz's English was limited, but they communicated through combination of gestures, simple vocabulary, and drawings that allowed basic exchange of information and occasional humor. O'Brien treated prisoners as workers rather than enemies, provided fair treatment in exchange for reasonable effort, and maintained security through mutual respect rather than intimidation. The transformation from enemies to humans happened gradually through daily interactions that revealed shared experiences and common humanity, despite national differences and ideological conflicts that had created the war. Fritz learned that O'Brien had family members who'd immigrated from Ireland during the famine, had grown up poor, had enlisted for economic opportunity rather than patriotic fervor. O'Brien learned that Fritz had been conscripted, had served because refusing meant punishment, had fought without particular enthusiasm for Nazi ideology that he'd found disturbing even before the war turned against Germany. The treatment that contradicted everything. American treatment of German prisoners often exceeded minimum legal requirements, reflecting cultural attitudes about appropriate behavior toward defeated enemies and practical recognition that humane treatment improved camp security by reducing prisoner motivation to escape or resist. The result was POW experience that many German prisoners found surprisingly comfortable, despite the fundamental loss of freedom that captivity represented. Fritz Weber and the other prisoners captured near Bastogne were processed through temporary holding facility before transfer to permanent camps in France, or eventually the United States. The processing included medical examination, delousing with DDT powder to prevent typhus, documentation of identity and military service, and interrogation that was professional rather than brutal. Wounded prisoners received medical treatment that was comparable to care provided to American casualties. German and American soldiers were treated in the same field hospitals by the same medical personnel using the same supplies and procedures. The food continued throughout processing. Fritz received 3 meals daily, each containing adequate calories and reasonable variety. Breakfast typically included porridge or scrambled eggs from powder, bread, and coffee. Lunch was often sandwiches or cold rations. Dinner featured hot meals similar to what American troops received: stew, pasta, occasionally roasted meat with vegetables. The quality varied depending on circumstances, but the quantity remained consistent and substantially exceeded what Fritz had been receiving as German soldier during the final months before his capture. The treatment created cognitive dissonance that Fritz struggled to process. The propaganda had prepared him for cruelty, torture, and systematic abuse that would make him regret surrendering instead of fighting to death. Reality was daily routine that was boring but not harsh, guards who were professional but not brutal, and living conditions that were austere but significantly better than frontline service in collapsing German army. Other prisoners shared his confusion. Fritz talked with dozens of German soldiers during his first weeks in captivity, discovering that nearly everyone had similar experiences: expectations of torture that never materialized, assumptions about American barbarism that were contradicted by actual treatment, and propaganda about Allied atrocities that seemed increasingly like lies rather than truth. One conversation particularly stuck with Fritz. He was talking with Feldwebel Hans Richter, a sergeant who'd been captured at the same time, about their treatment by American forces. Richter had fought on the Eastern Front before being transferred west in 1944, had seen what German forces did to Soviet prisoners and civilians, and was expressing amazement that Americans weren't reciprocating with equivalent brutality. "They should hate us," Richter said quietly. "We've been bombing their cities, killing their soldiers, fighting them for 5 years. But they give us food and medical care like we're guests instead of prisoners. I don't understand it." Fritz didn't understand it either. But he was grateful for treatment that seemed generous rather than merely adequate, humane rather than just legal. The taste of industrial capacity. The food that German prisoners received wasn't exceptional by American standards. It was standard military rations that American soldiers complained about regularly. But to prisoners who'd been subsisting on declining German military rations for months or years, American food represented abundance that demonstrated industrial capacity and logistical competence that Germany couldn't match. The variety was particularly striking. American rations included dozens of different meal options, even within limited categories like C rations and K rations. Prisoners might receive beef stew one day, ham and beans the next, spaghetti and meat sauce the third. Desserts included canned fruit, cookies, chocolate bars. Beverages included coffee, powdered milk, lemonade mix. The variety prevented monotony that characterized German rations, which had featured the same limited options repeated endlessly. The packaging was sophisticated in ways that German military logistics had never achieved. American rations came in sealed tins or waxed cardboard that protected contents from moisture and contamination. The packaging included can openers, utensils, cigarettes, matches, and other items that made field consumption practical without requiring additional equipment. German rations came in packaging that often failed to preserve contents adequately and required soldiers to provide their own eating utensils and other necessities. The abundance extended beyond food to other aspects of prisoner life. Clothing was provided when needed. Wool blankets, winter coats, boots in correct sizes, rather than whatever mismatched items happened to be available. Medical supplies were plentiful enough that minor ailments received treatment that German military medical services had been forced to ignore due to shortages. Recreational items like playing cards, books, and sports equipment were provided to reduce boredom during confinement. Fritz received new boots in January 1945 after his original German-issue boots had worn through during the retreat across France. The American boots were properly sized, well-constructed, and immediately comfortable in ways that German military boots rarely achieved even when new. The boots were standard American issue rather than anything special, but to Fritz, they represented industrial capacity that could provide quality equipment even to prisoners who theoretically deserved minimal consideration. The letters that revealed the contrast. Fritz was permitted to write letters home under regulations that allowed prisoner correspondence subject to censorship that prevented transmission of military information. His letters to his mother in Bavaria described conditions that created emotional responses she found difficult to reconcile with her understanding of what captivity should mean. He wrote in April 1945, "Mother, I am well fed and safe. The Americans give us 3 meals daily, adequate shelter, and medical care when needed. I work on farms during the day, but the work is not cruel. The guards are professional, but not brutal. I know this sounds strange, but I am living better as American 8th, 1945. The war in Europe ended with German surrender. Fritz Weber was still a prisoner in France, still working on agricultural labor details, still living in camp that had become familiar over 4 months of captivity. The announcement of German surrender created complex emotions, relief that the killing was over, uncertainty about what repatriation would mean, and recognition that Germany had lost completely rather than achieving negotiated peace that some had hoped for. Repatriation began in late 1945, but proceeded slowly because Germany was occupied, infrastructure was destroyed, and administrative chaos made processing millions of prisoners and refugees extremely difficult. Fritz remained in American custody until February 1946, spending 10 months as prisoner after the war had officially ended. The extended captivity was frustrating, but also provided time to process experiences and contemplate future that seemed uncertain and potentially grim. Fritz was repatriated to Bavaria in February 1946, returning to family home that had survived the war physically intact but economically devastated. Germany was rubble, economy was collapsed, and prospects for rebuilding seemed distant and uncertain. Fritz was American prisoner, then I lived as German soldier during the final year before my capture. Please do not worry about me. I will survive this captivity and come home when the war ends. His mother's response expressed relief, but also confusion. Fritz, I am grateful you are safe and well treated, but I cannot understand why Americans would treat German prisoners kindly when our soldiers have been fighting them for so long. The newspapers here say different things about American treatment, but your letters suggest they are not the monsters we have been told about. I do not know what to believe anymore. The cognitive dissonance wasn't limited to prisoners and their families. German civilians who received letters from prisoners in American camps learned information that contradicted propaganda about Allied cruelty and barbarism. The letters documented treatment that was professional and generally humane, living conditions that were basic but adequate, and food that was often better than what German civilians were receiving under conditions of economic collapse and systematic starvation that characterized Germany during the final year of the war. The information created doubts about other propaganda claims. If Americans weren't torturing prisoners as claimed, what else might be lies? If prisoners were being fed adequately while German civilians starved, what did that reveal about relative industrial capacity and social organization? If enemy forces were demonstrating humanity that German propaganda insisted they lacked, what did that suggest about the values that different societies actually held? The end that became beginning. They worked odd jobs, struggled with food shortages that made American prisoner rations seem luxurious in retrospect, and eventually found steady employment in reconstruction efforts that would consume Germany for years. But he never forgot the treatment he'd received as American prisoner. The memory stayed with him through decades of post-war life, through Germany's economic recovery and integration into Western alliance, through years when former enemies became friends and Germany became one of America's closest allies. The meals he'd eaten as prisoner had been more than just food. They'd been lessons about values and civilization that distinguished societies which maintained humanitarian principles from those which abandoned them when expedient.